We often hear about the importance of capturing a family's story and the importance of the story in developing a family business identity and creating a legacy. Today, we'll be talking with two people who are very experienced in helping family businesses document their stories. Goetz and Melissa Parks, co-founders of Journey 66. So we keep hearing about the importance of family businesses documenting their story. For example, how the business was started and the hardships the family has overcome. Why does the family business story matter?
That's such a great question. And thank you so much for having us today. We're really excited to be here. Well, in the simplest words, like you said, it does connect the later generations, the rising gen, the next generations to the values. But how do you remember things? It's through story. You think of all the great stories that your parents read to you growing up, and you remember them because there was something at stake, right? And there was hardship that was overcome, and there was triumph, and you really connect with that, the story of that. And so when you think of telling your family business story, it's a way to connect the later generations, the rising gen, the third and fourth and fifth generation to those values that have become a little bit empty through the years, right? You have the values on the walls in your company, like we believe in hard work and we believe in generosity. But what does that really mean? Where were those values founded? And it's in the stories where you begin to realize, these were founded over real issues when something really hard happened, when something was at stake.
Jay Hughes, his book came out 20 years ago. The landmark book, it was all about legacy, which added human capital and intellectual capital to wealth. And what other way to pass all that along? And that's what we want, right? We want to sustain the family business into the future. I don't know of any other way but through storytelling and through great stories. And so the family business story, I would argue, is the only way that you are able, in some sense, to capture all of that and pass that on into the next generation.
So how is a family business story like a memoir and maybe different from like a branding story?
So we like to use the metaphor of a memoir in talking about the family business story because the family business story is complex. If you think about a brand video or a branding story, and by the way, in the last 20 years, the industry has been filled with story conferences. TEDx and TED have had people speak on story. In fact, I was at a conference for families just recently, and there was this main speaker on story. That's all well and good, but those tend to be really abstract until you ask the question, how do we tell our family story? And so suddenly, that's why we use the language of memoir, because a good memoirist organizes his or her story. And it's not just one story, right? It's this complex collection of stories. And he or she does this in the form of what we call tentpole scenes. And a tentpole scene are these 5 to 7 defining moments. Let me give you just an example. So we worked with a family, 120-year-old family business, in fact, started 1907 when the Cubs won the World Series, which is relevant to us in here in Chicago, right? So and by the way, every family business story is epic, I would say, and theirs is an epic story. So it's a full century of wrenching change in their industry, 2 world wars, tragic death in the family. There was a split in the family, not so much where they went separate ways, but they had one side of the family said they were going to innovate, and they moved from being a business to consumer business to a business to business. Well, that took 30, 40 years. So those are epic stories. And so those are tentpole scenes. And one of the tentpole scene was in 1955 when they had a fire that wiped out their entire business. And so I think your question is all about how it's like a memoir. Is that a great memoir is pinned down by these defining moments. And so then there's all these other stories that you use to fill in and to create flow and to create action. But a good memoir and a good family business has these, what we call tentpole scenes.
Just to flesh out that story that Dave started to tell. So in 1955, there was a fire, and they were an oil delivery business at that time. And the fire consumed their entire business, including all their oil delivery trucks. And they didn't know what they were going to do. The brothers who were all running the company, what do we do? Do we go work for somebody else? What do we do? And so they went to this oilman's association that they were a part of. And their competitors said, we want to serve your customers until you get back on track, until you rebuild. And then they gave them their customers back after that period of time. And this was an extremely generous act. And one of their key values today, going back to why do we tell the family story, is generosity. And it goes back to that defining moment when somebody was so generous to them. And so Tentpole Scenes, they say something deeper than just the beginning, the middle, and the end. Just like a memoir is, in every story that they are telling, they're trying to reflect on what that meant. They're trying to impart wisdom, because why else would anybody pick up a memoir? They want to connect with the human and what they've learned and learn something new. And that's the same with the family business story, is these Tentpole Scenes, these major moments when something was at stake. What wisdom can be imparted? What can the next generation learn from this?
Oh, that's a perfect example. And you're right. Many times families, they use these words like our values of generosity, but this explains why. And it also tells the next gen, what do we mean by being generous, right? Oh, I love that. So you've helped countless families capture their family business story. So what are some of the advantages and outcomes you've seen?
A good example is we worked with an Orthodox Jewish businessman who founded a business in South Africa. And his family had been persecuted in the war and found their way from Latvia to South America. And he worked for his father and then started this business, which was an oil business. Now, not like drilling for oil, but car oil business. So he grew this business. It became huge. And then he sold it to a German conglomerate. So here his family had been persecuted by the Germans in World War II. And yet he built this business in the 60s and 70s and then turned around and sold it to the Germans and then went to work for them. So it had all these wonderful layers. His purpose in writing his memoir, it was really a memoir, and it was very simple. The memoir was called Zaidi. And Zaidi means grandfather in Yiddish. And he wrote it for his grandchildren because he wanted to say, listen, I've had all this success, but through all this success, again, it's these deeper values that have guided me and sustained me. What was so interesting about this was chapter 5 was about his affair with his wife's first cousin. And when he decided to put that in the memoir, we went, whoa.
You want to do this?
Are you sure you want to do that? And it was a little bit awkward for us, but we went through, but he wanted to tell the story because he also wanted to talk about the mistakes. And so he had been a little bit disconnected from this family because he moved out of South Africa, moved to the States. And so he wanted to reconnect with that generation. So there were only 50 copies created for this book, but it was a founder's story. And it, again, the outcome was it was a way to transmit these values and talk about them that you really can't talk about when you're getting up in the morning at your Aspen condo over spring break, right? It's hard to talk about these things. And it kind of memorializes them in the form of story that can be passed on and people can go back to.
I'd also mention that as families get bigger and bigger, and it becomes more of a family enterprise than a family business, the family story becomes this hub. It becomes a center. It pulls all these kind of other satellites into the identity, because I think there's a tendency to get further and further away of your identity. And you don't even know like why you're serving the way you're serving your customers, or maybe you don't even know what you stand for. But when you can go back to that foundational, that core story, it can reinvigorate family members and give them a sense of identity.
So are there any common hurdles you've witnessed in capturing a family story?
I would say that time and capacity is always an issue for families who are investigating. Should we tell our family story now? Because it's going to take time. It usually takes longer than you think it's going to take. It takes about a year of time. But we have found that when there is a leader who is committed to this, and often it's a founder, we work with lots of founders, or it could be a second or third generation leader who recognizes that, hey, if I don't capture the story now, then it's going to slip away and it's going to be gone forever. So when there's an urgency attached to it, that time issue becomes less of an issue. But family business stories demand lots of voices, lots of people, because unless it's a founder story. But if you're going to tell a full family business story, it's going to demand interviewing people. It's going to demand doing research and finding records and images. And that does take time and capacity. So that is an obstacle.
It is. And I think, as you said, so with this family story that we were mentioning, it was third generation CEO who had an older brother or older cousin, was it? Who was the CEO before him. And he was aging. And I wouldn't say that his memory was slipping, but I think there was a fear. But him and his brother, this older gentleman and his brother, could still remember and recall the smell when they walked in 1955 to that fire, the first time they could smell it. And so you want somebody to be able to recall that. Once that person is gone, that person is gone, and that smell is gone, and recalling that smell. So often it's this mortality, right? And people start to go, oh my gosh, I guess we're not going to live forever. How do we take the pain and suffering? It's wisdom. Again, back to Jay Hughes. It's that intellectual capital or wisdom that they've learned and pass that on to the next generation.
I also mentioned that another hurdle is getting the right people on board to do the work. So you might have somebody in the family who, say, was an English major in college, and they say, I'm a writer. Then they start to write the book or undertake the research and putting it together. And they realize that they don't really have the skill to write like a memoir style family legacy book. It's just a unique skill that you may be a good writer, but can you write a book? And so that can derail projects. If you don't have the right people on board to do the work, then you can get overwhelmed and it just gets put on the back burner and it sometimes doesn't get accomplished at all.
I would think even sometimes with difficult topics, it might be nice having someone not in the family. Because I know, teaching next gen, sometimes, especially founders, they sugarcoat things, but you want the next gen to know about, for example, that story of the fire and the resilience and how they built back, which some families might have left that part out and all you get is the glory. Then the next gen doesn't learn anything. So when do you know it's time to start capturing your family business's story? Are there any signs?
Well, there are often different triggers for families. And one of those triggers is what Dave already mentioned, is somebody coming face to face with their mortality and realizing I'm not going to be around forever. The previous generation isn't going to be around forever. And if we don't move on this, then we're going to lose the story forever. So I think when people are recognizing that mortality, it's a big trigger for people. I think also when there are milestone events that can trigger somebody to begin a project. We're working with a family right now. It's a founder story, and the founder and his wife are going to be celebrating their 55th anniversary, and they want to have their family story written by then in a year as a gift to leave for their children and their grandchildren.
It just triggered a thought that some of these stories, we do both documentaries, video libraries, we did a video anthology, books. And so there's not one form. People often think book, but sometimes it's not a book. Sometimes it might be a website where family members can blog and collect video, and it doesn't have to be a book or a traditional book. And there's also many ways to create books. We did one book recently for a family, 30 short stories that were short memories, about 600 words for each story, along with a lot of pictures from the family throughout history. And it was just wonderful. And they were reflections, but they were really well told. There were some vendors. There was recollections of one of the family members who died, but you could dip in and dip out. It wasn't a traditional 250-page book you got to slog through, to get to the end.
Oh, that's interesting. So there's also different types of ways of doing this, and I'm sure it fits also with, the family's personality. And I also love how it's not just about obviously the mortality issue, but what a great thing to do for an anniversary or a milestone too. It's wonderful. So I have to thank you very much, Dave Goetz and Melissa Parks of Journey 66 for being with me. I'm Kim Edelson with FamilyBusiness.org, and I highly suggest you get your family stories and your memoirs down. Thank you for being with me.
Thank you so much. That's a wrap.